Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. We're coming to you live from the Education USA Forum in Washington, D.C. That's right, it's back after 3 years of not meeting in person since 2019. We're back here at the forum, so we're going to be taking a little walk around and discussing some of the highlights from the meeting today over the last 2 days that have been happening with international education and with the Education USA team, all the REACs that are here, 50 plus advisors are here, 350 or so U.S. college and university representatives, association reps, English language programs, they're all here at the forum this week. It started yesterday, in the middle of it today. We're highlighting today amongst the kind of the regular features of the forum. There will be the global showcase later this afternoon, where all the advisors as well as members of the DC Embassy community will be at tables in the main ballroom here. We've just finishing lunch up for the day after three sessions this morning. One more session this afternoon before we break for the global showcase. What I've noticed so far, this has been a continuing trend I've seen, certainly with international education over the last few months as conferences have gotten back in session. There's been a couple of neat additions here at the EdUSA Forum. I think they had something like this last time, but they certainly had a version of this at NAFSA at their booth. It's got a kind of do your own selfie kind of a project here. So you tap on the screen, you've got your circle light that you always those who've been doing remote sessions and certainly know about. Take a shot. You can have as a frame that you can do, posting yourself study in the USA with Education USA. So it's some really nice. Aaron, good to see you there. Hope everything's well with you in Kansas. We're having a great conference so far. One of the themes I wanted to touch on that for those who get the newsletter, and again, we do our newsletter every Monday, comes out. It's called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. And that goes out to all our subscribers either through our website or via LinkedIn. We've got over 800 subscribers currently receiving that newsletter every Monday. So if you're not already subscribed, certainly encourage you to do so. That newsletter featured this week some stories about defining parts about the United States that have real value for international audiences. One of those was the story up front on the percentage of billion-dollar startups that currently are led by students, former international students who are studied at U.S. institutions that are now their CEOs. So providing some real hard, fast data and obviously great examples that colleges and universities should use to help promote studying in the United States. And I think one of the shifts I'm seeing, and for those who attended the virtual Education USA Forum last year, that's when the joint statement on international education was released. This was the first real positive statement from the federal government since I think it was April 2020, when initiative that under the Clinton administration led by Al Gore, Vice President Gore, led to the creation of International Education Week, which has become such a mainstay on college and university campuses in November every year around the release of Open Doors. But one of the other things that this conference has certainly alluded to, and you might not be able to see it on the screen here, but there was just a session right before lunch on this joint statement on international education 1 year on. And the panel included all the four main signatories or participants, interagencies within the federal government that were part of that initial joint statement, which was initially issued by in a joint videos from Department of State with Secretary of State Blinken and Department of Education with Secretary Mendoza. Both of them initially kind of started the game, ball rolling, and then you had Department of Homeland Security, Department of Commerce that joined in as well. And what's happened in the year since, there hasn't been a lot, frankly, that we've seen come out of that, at least publicly. There hasn't been a lot that's been done. From the session we learned today that it's been primarily the interagency collaboration and kind of defining roles, and which still aren't very clear, frankly, even after today's discussion. But you think about why students want to come and study in the United States. There are realistically a ton of hurdles that still exist. I had the opportunity to ask the panel in that session. That's great that the statement is out there, but what about things that are they'd each said what they're doing individually, and there wasn't really a lot said in terms of what this is a product of our interagency cooperation. That wasn't a part of their discussions, and frankly, I'm not surprised by that. That's the nature of, frankly, federal government, that even when they set up and say that they're collaborating, the evidence of that isn't often too widely known, or at least publicized. And that's part of our challenge as a country. We don't really jointly coordinate what we're doing internationally on recruitment. They have different missions, frankly, the different departments. We have Department of Commerce that has a very business-focused, money-focused export is the language that they use. And language, as one of my colleagues, Clay Hensley, pointed out, now he's on his own call right now, but one of the points he made was that the different departments have their own individual mission statements, and when it relates to international education, public diplomacy is the driving force of why state does what it does. I've heard in the past why foreign students come to the United States, because foreign students today, world leaders tomorrow. And they rely on statistics that show that 33% of world leaders today studied at some point in the United States. And that's great data. And that certainly fits their public diplomacy mission, because they want students to come here, study here, go home, and become leaders in their home country, and then have had positive experiences here. And then they share those with their countrymen, and leads to favorable policies toward the United States from those countries. And I get that. That's totally above board, and I buy into that 125%. But what we see happening is now with this joint statement and individual agencies kind of doing their own thing toward a common goal, loosely defined common goal that is outlined in those principles, we don't see a lot of what's going on. And that's, when you don't know what's going on, you assume things, and that how dangerous that is and what that leads to. But you see realities popping up. And the question I asked was, one of the points of the question I asked, I had three different questions, but one of the points of the question I asked was, what are the individual things that the different departments are doing are great, but they're not game changers. They acknowledge that we're in a globally competitive market, and that the UK, Canada, Australia are doing much different and much more coordinated actions, and have policies that are much more favorable to international students than we have in the United States, and they recognize that. But it's outside their bailiwick to really affect that kind of change. That's legislative change that's going to need to be impacted or initiated to really make a significant difference. And the question I didn't get to ask during the session, I asked individually afterwards, was, well, what's the end result here? What's the goal? Is there going to be a unified joint policy, international education policy, a strategic plan for international education? And the answer was, we don't know yet. The Department of Commerce, one of the Gabrielle Zelaya from U.S. Commercial Service, she made very clear that they have just released for the first time an international export strategy, national international export strategy that includes strong elements of education in it, and but education is viewed in commercial services terms as a commodity, as an export commodity in a strictly dollars and cents kind of way, which for many international educators, that oftentimes gets our hackles up, and because it's monetizing everything that we do, and that's a harsh reality of life on campus. But that shouldn't be a motivation, and certainly shouldn't be how we're promoting the U.S. to overseas students. That's certainly an internal value that perhaps we're getting from we're realizing why we do what we do in the U.S. And certainly universities. There are many universities that will look at it as a bottom line exercise, not a cultural expansion and helping educate our international students on what's going on, our domestic students on what's going on in the world by bringing international students from all over the world. So there's a lot of dichotomies that we see developing with this joint strategy, and one of the permutations was, well, does this mean that because of our strength as a country, because we're so individualized, we're decentralized on many levels, that there doesn't need to be an international ed strategy? And I would say, let's not go down that road, because that's basically what we've been doing the last 30, 40 years in terms of international education. We've never had anything close to this. And this is an opportunity, frankly, if we're ever going to get a national strategy for international education, it has to start with this joint statement. And that's what the hope was, I think, coming out of that last year. And whether we get to a point where we actually have a national strategy and what would be needed to make that happen, I think there's a lot of pieces of this puzzle that haven't been thought through yet, or certainly publicly haven't been acknowledged as this is something we need to be doing. And statements to that effect are kind of few and far between in this session. One of the outcomes of that statement last year was they need to be doing more together. They have regular interagency meetings. We don't really know the outcomes of those, because nothing's final until it's final, type of thing. But each of the individual departments made their case for what they're doing, and there's some neat things coming out of education in terms of workforce development and career and technical education promotion with other countries, and using that as a model to help bridge the gaps that exist. But there are players that are missing from the table. And Department of Labor would be one of those, because one of the end goals of the current immigration system for international students that want to stay and work long term is H-1B processing, which is a Department of Labor piece. And that's, and in addition to the regulatory hurdles that exist and that would need legislation to change in terms of having F1 students or the F1 visa category be considered dual intent instead of non-immigrant. And that's, we know, and anyone who's been in international admissions for more than a minute realizes that's one of the most significant hurdles to international students coming to the United States. So until the kind of game changer pieces happen, and that dual intent piece for F1 students that would have to be legislatively passed by Congress, until that happens, we're not on par with our competitors in terms of Canada, Australia, UK. UK's instituted this work visa, two-year work visa, post-grad or post-study work visa. That certainly is a clearer path. We have the paths in the United States, but because of the way we categorize students, we're at a competitive disadvantage. With our non-immigrant students having to prove at age 18, if they're coming as an undergraduate, prove that they know what they want to do for the rest of their lives. And that includes knowing when they're done with their degree what their plan is and that they're planning to come home. Because if they say that they're planning to stay in the United States, get a green card eventually, that's violating the 214B principle. There you are, showing immigrant intent. And even though it's legally possible for them, once they're in the United States, to do their OPT, to get a company to sponsor them for H-1B, they can't say that when they're applying for their visa. And that's the fundamental disconnect that's happening between policy and reality in terms of promoting our country as a destination for international students. But do want to give some props to ECA and Education USA. They've started a new podcast, so not a competitor podcast. I actually listen to it myself, the Edge podcast, talking about guidance, leadership, and expertise on the international ed side. So we have folks at a team at IAE that are part of that discussion, are regular helping to produce that podcast. So one of my old employers, I'm very happy to say that they are actively engaged in helping to educate the higher ed community on certain aspects of what's happening in federal government and leadership around immigration issues. So there's a lot going on. I mentioned at the top that this is one of the focuses of this session is on why the United States and why the U.S. is and should be and will continue to be a leading destination for international students. And I will say that what I have seen during the conference and this last session on the joint statement was made it a little bit strange in terms of the way language is being used. I already alluded to that with regard to why the missions of education, commerce, DHS, and state are very different, and in terms of how they talk about international education. And if ever a time would come, should come, where there's common language being used around international education related to a joint statement, you would hope it would be on this very topic. So what we're seeing happen is Commerce is talking about it from a financial perspective. States talking about it from a diplomatic, public diplomacy point of view. You have DHS talking about it from a security point of view and regulation point of view. And then you have education that's talking about it from an internal kind of diversity point of view, which is, I think, in line with a lot of what international educators believe. But in terms of how it's being promoted, they're working at cross purposes in a lot of ways. You have Commerce Department has led this charge over the last couple of years, actually since the last NAFSA in 2019. It was in person before this year. USA a study destination. That initially was kind of an alignment of all the state consortia around the country, now 35 different state organizations that exist. And you see that language that they're using with the Commerce Department. They have this USA a study destination. It's now become an external student-focused global marketing campaign to help promote the U.S. as a destination. I love the thought, and yeah, that needs to be happening. It's focusing on the individual states where these consortia exist. What is missing is really a sense of that cooperation amongst the agencies. They oftentimes aren't invited they may be invited to the same events, but they're playing secondary roles. State at commerce events and commerce at state events. So you see a lot of language that's being used in these promotions, like it's USA a study destination. Why aren't we promoting ourselves as the study destination? There's language that they're also using about promoting the U.S. as an option, not the option, the premier study destination instead of a premier study destination. So there's a lot going on in terms of how language is used that I think is making the attempts to do a coordinated national policy on international education much more of a pipe dream, I think, in terms of concrete results. I don't think the reality is right now that until there are some of these game changer outcomes that are part of a larger policy that is top down led, because right now there's interagency meetings, but no one's really taken the lead, and it's not clear certainly not clear what the end goal is yet, whether there should be a policy or not. They're not committing to that, and that's a bit of a worry, and certainly in the end it would mean nothing really changes, other than each department has their own policies that are specifically international ed related. What we don't see happening is really any change to government policy, because it's individual departments that do represent the federal government in a lot of ways, but the actual changes to what international educators would need is something that isn't going to happen through this group until there's top-down leadership. And does that mean having an international ed czar at the cabinet level to make this happen? Like you have an immigration czar, you have or a border control czar that Vice President Harris was supposed to be taking on. You have other things that raise to the level of national importance and get that kind of exposure. If that ever were to happen, I think you'd see a lot more focus on it, and I think that's part of it. We don't see a lot happening. And as international educators, we tend to be impatient bunches. But we learn over the years that, and certainly those who have been in the business more than a minute, we know it takes time to affect the kind of change that we need. And a lot of what we're talking about will require legislative change. I mentioned making F1 dual intent status. I mentioned the green cards for STEM PhD students, automatically getting them upon graduation. I asked the question about, the changes in the way we teach in the United States. and around the world, but certainly on college campuses, the pandemic has accelerated a lot of moves of how courses are delivered to more online and less in person. And what does that mean when we return to a pre-pandemic normal, if that ever will exist? I don't think it will, but in terms of regulations, we've had the extension of the regulation of the temporary limit on the number of classes that international students can take online, that they've been able to take a full semester. If they were already in the US before they started, they can take a full semester online. Students that came into the United States need to be, after the pandemic started, they need to be enrolled in at least one in-person class. That's been the rule, but how long is that going to last? The reality is our colleges have changed the way we instruct students. Larger lecture classes are going away and maybe gone forever in terms of in-person. Many colleges offer those only online during the pandemic and are continuing that now that the pandemic and full and in-person operations are possible. So it's really an interesting dichotomy in terms of what's going on with the talk around international education and promoting it, the U.S. as a destination globally. I don't think we have our collective acts together yet as amongst government agencies. They're talking all the ways, but are the results coming at the speed that we would like in the field? No, because a lot of what we need to see change is outside their control, and that's the frustrating part. And certainly it's not a new part of what we do, but certainly I do want to give them credit. In the end, Commerce, State, DHS, and Education around the same table, promoting similar messages on what they've been doing since July last year to announce plans for greater international education visibility within their portfolios, and so that's been encouraging to see that. But we don't really have concrete results yet that are game-changing results, and I think that's what many in the profession were a little bit skeptical when that was first announced, but maybe now we're a little bit more realistic, and it will take time to see the kind of change that we really need. But it will require advocacy. It will require institutional organizations, membership organizations that many of those are already have their legislative affairs and advocacy groups pushing for some of the things I was talking about earlier. But it does require some top-down support that frankly isn't there yet. The idea for a joint statement was great, but we never really saw cabinet level, White House level support for it, other than yes, we endorse this. So it'd be interesting to see what happens next. And certainly this week has certainly allowed us to reflect on where we've come since the pandemic and the many miles we have to go before we can be satisfied that we're back on track and we're where we need to be as a country. But there's just some great stories coming out of this in terms of what individual institutions have been able to do, what education is being able to do. We saw a great video that was released on lunch yesterday after the opening plenary that was of association leaders. So that video is one of many that my friends at IIE are helping to coordinate with an outside marketing agency that will serve as State Department's global campaign to promote the USA as a study destination, or part of their efforts to contribute to the joint statement on international education. So many miles to go before we sleep, but positive steps, but certainly not the level of coordination and frankly cooperation and advocacy from the top level down at the White House to show that we're actually moving in the right direction and having an international ed policy at the national level. So don't expect anything soon on that front, but certainly plenty of us who've been in the field for a while, as well as new folks that are coming here for the first time. We're seeing a lot of new folks at the forum this week, probably I would say at least half, which matches what we saw at International ACAC in July and also at NAFSA, where 40% were new. So that was first-timers. We're seeing, frankly, it's a reflection of the changing nature of our field, how we've had more and more senior leadership in international education leave their positions in the past few months, past 2 years, And now it's a matter of just meeting the challenges with a whole new generation of talented folks who are eager to learn and get plugged in. So we'll see what happens with that, but that's all we have for you today, live from the EdUSA Forum in Washington, D.C. Thanks again for joining, and we'll be in touch soon. Cheers.